The hum of the Rolls-Royce engine softened as the car approached the mansion's towering iron gates. The evening sky blushed purple, streaked with fading gold, the kind of view he had once promised himself he would own. Yet when the car halted and the security guard stepped forward, flashlight beam slicing across his face, the air grew heavier than any night in his memory. "Step back, sir. This is private property." The words cut deeper than the chill in the air, deeper than any insult whispered behind his back in boardrooms. His chest tightened. Not again, he thought. He sat frozen, staring at the gate that should have opened at his arrival, a gate he had purchased with his hard-earned billions. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, but the scent mocked him, reminding him that the land, the house, the future within those gates, all of it was his. And still, the man with the flashlight did not move. He wasn't a stranger trying to trespass. He wasn't a guest. He was the owner, the master of this estate. But the guard's tone carried authority, as if centuries of exclusion had been distilled into a single command. "You don't belong here." The driver shifted uneasily, glancing into the rearview mirror. "Mr. Carter," he whispered, his voice heavy with disbelief. Mr. Carter said nothing. He could hear his heartbeat, each thump echoing the rhythm of a story he had lived before. He remembered the schoolyard, where he was told the swings weren't for kids like him. He remembered the shop floor, where managers double-checked his ID while ignoring everyone else. He remembered the country club, where they insisted he must have taken a wrong turn. The words changed faces but never meaning. Even here, outside a mansion that bore his name on the deed, he was still unwelcome. The security guard cleared his throat, louder this time. "I said, step back, sir. Residents only." The absurdity almost made him laugh. Residents only. Who had invested in the estate? Who had wired millions to secure it? Who had walked through endless meetings, survived betrayals, and built empires from scratch just for moments like this? His hand tightened on the leather armrest. He had built a fortress of power, yet the gate before him was another wall of doubt, erected in an instant. A mansion could be bought, but belonging was never for sale. He leaned forward, lowering the tinted window. The cool night air brushed against his skin, sharp and brisk, like a slap of reality. "This is my property," he said evenly, his voice calm but resonant. The guard hesitated, his flashlight wobbling slightly, but then steadied again. "No record of that, sir. Residents only." The words replayed, circling inside Carter's mind like a cruel chorus. He felt both fury and sorrow rise within him, two rivers colliding. His driver exhaled sharply, perhaps expecting Carter to explode. Instead, the billionaire CEO swallowed the storm building inside, forcing composure. For decades, he had learned to turn pain into power. This would be no different. The gate stood tall, black iron bars stretching upward, crowned with gold crests. They glimmered like a promise and a prison at once. Carter studied them, his reflection faintly visible between their lines. The reflection looked back at him. An impeccably dressed man, powerful, admired, feared even. Yet behind the expensive suit and the confident frame, he saw the boy who had once stared through fences he couldn't cross, dreaming of freedom on the other side. The boy was still there, and tonight the gate was laughing at him. He clenched his fists. He wouldn't let this night bury him under humiliation. He would carve meaning out of it. For a moment, silence settled over the standoff. Cicadas hummed in the background, a soundtrack to his anger. Carter's gaze didn't waver. He could fire the guard now, call in lawyers, bring the world crashing down on these men who had dared to stop him. But in that silence, he thought of his journey. The nights when he had nothing but determination, the mornings when rejection tried to choke his ambition. He thought of his mother's voice. "Don't fight to be let in, son. Build doors of your own." And though he had built not just a door but a palace, still the world found ways to push him outside. The humiliation wasn't just his own. He knew there were millions who would recognize this moment in their own lives, people who had been told, at the edge of opportunity, that they didn't belong. He felt their voices in the night, whispering through memory, fueling his resolve. If he walked away quietly, this moment would vanish, just another private scar. But if he chose differently, if he stood tall, if he faced the gate as more than one man but as a symbol, then the sting could become strength, not just for him, but for all who carried the same wound. The security guard shifted again, his voice sharp. "Sir, I will have to call backup." The words rang like an alarm, not of danger, but of disrespect. Backup for the man who owned the estate. Backup for the man who had risen higher than they could imagine. Carter inhaled deeply. His mind replayed the milestones, the handshake that closed his first million-dollar deal, the courtroom where he fought to protect his company, the endless nights spent studying balance sheets when others slept. Each moment had built him brick by brick, and here, at the gate, all of it was being tested. Would he crumble into rage or rise into something greater? The driver opened his mouth to protest, but Carter lifted a hand. Silence. His gaze never left the gate. His tone, when he finally spoke, was steady as steel. "Call whoever you need. Tonight I'll remind everyone exactly who I am." He leaned back in his seat, the leather embracing him like armor. The humiliation had lit a fire. He would not simply demand entry, he would redefine what it meant to belong. The guards thought they were keeping him out. They had no idea they were unlocking the most dangerous version of him, the man who turned rejection into revolution. He closed his eyes just for a second, and the present dissolved into memory. The iron gates melted away, and he was once again a boy in the cracked concrete schoolyard of his old neighborhood. The air had smelled of chalk dust and fried food, drifting from corner stores. He remembered standing at the edge of the basketball court, sneakers worn thin, watching other kids play. When he asked if he could join, a taller boy sneered, "Nah, not you. You don't belong here." The words stung, not because he couldn't play, he knew he could, but because of the conviction in the boy's voice. Like it was fact, like it was written somewhere in the rules of the universe. Those 3 words had followed him everywhere. You don't belong. They chased him down hallways, echoed in classrooms, even trailed him home. He remembered one afternoon sitting at the kitchen table, his mother folding laundry by the window. She noticed the heaviness in his face and asked what was wrong. He mumbled something about not being wanted on the court. She stopped folding, looked him straight in the eye and said, "Don't fight for space on someone else's team. Build your own." At the time, the advice felt too big for him. He was just a kid with hand-me-down notebooks and empty pockets, but the words planted a seed. The boy who didn't belong became the teenager who refused to accept limits. In high school, when teachers lowered their expectations, assuming he'd vanish into statistics, he raised his hand higher, pushed harder, yet every achievement came with whispers. He's smart, but he's talented, but there was always a but. And underneath the but was the same old sentence. He doesn't belong here. Each time he carved that wound deeper into memory, not as weakness, but as fuel. He promised himself that one day he would build a life so undeniable that no one could block him again. Still, the scars formed quietly. He remembered his first part-time job at a downtown electronics shop, stacking boxes and sweeping floors. The owner always watched him more closely than the others, always double-checked his work, as if waiting for a mistake. Customers sometimes asked if he was lost, assuming he couldn't possibly work there. He swallowed the humiliation and smiled, but each time it cut another line into the story of his life. The lesson was bitter yet clear. You could show up, you could work, you could give your best, and still, the world might treat you like a trespasser. That memory shifted into another, brighter but no less sharp. He had been invited to a birthday party at a classmate's home, a sprawling suburban house with a pool, manicured lawn, and a gate out front. The kind of place that made him feel like an outsider before he even stepped inside. When he arrived, one of the parents mistook him for help, asking if he was there to set up chairs. He smiled politely, corrected them, and joined the party. But the sting lingered. That night, he told himself, "One day I'll own the kind of house where no one can mistake me for anything less than what I am." And yet here he was, decades later, in front of his own mansion, hearing the same echo of that wound. Different place, same cut. The guard's words, "residents only," were the grown-up version of the schoolyard sneer, the shop owner's suspicion, the parent's mistake. Time had passed, billions had been made, empires had been built, but the refrain had survived the years. You don't belong here. It was almost poetic, almost mocking that his first night as master of the estate would summon the ghosts of his youth so perfectly. He exhaled slowly, dragging himself back into the present, but not before hearing his mother's voice again in memory. Don't fight for space on someone else's team. Build your own. He realized something now that he hadn't as a boy. Building your own team, your own table, your own empire. Yes, it brought wealth, power, and recognition, but it didn't erase the prejudice woven into the world. You could own the table, and still they'd treat you like a guest. You could own the court, and still they'd tell you not to play. You could own the mansion, and still they'd block you at the gate. The past and present folded into each other until the boy and the man felt like the same person. Carter's jaw tightened as he looked at the guard again. This wasn't just about a house. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about every barrier he'd ever faced, every humiliation he'd buried. The gate wasn't iron. It was history made solid. And standing before it, he knew one truth. Tonight, the boy who didn't belong would claim his place not just as owner, but as proof that belonging was never granted. It was seized. He let the silence stretch a moment longer, as if savoring the weight of his memories. Because he understood now what hurt him most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the reminder that no matter how high he climbed, the world would still try to shut him out. But that reminder also sharpened him. It told him that belonging was not about permission, and it never had been. Belonging was a declaration, and tonight he was ready to make it louder than ever before. The engine's steady hum outside the gate faded into the background as Carter's mind drifted deeper into memory. Not of wounds this time, but of battles fought and victories clawed from impossible odds. He had not stumbled into billions. His empire was built brick by brick, scar by scar. And to understand the fire in his chest tonight, you had to know the road that brought him here. It began in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and the faint odor of mildew that no amount of scrubbing could erase. His mother worked double shifts, her hands cracked and rough from cleaning offices that smelled of polished wood and stale cigar smoke. Carter remembered watching her return home late at night, shoulders bent with exhaustion, but eyes still burning with determination. "We don't get to quit, son," she would say, setting down her purse with a sigh. "Not us, not ever." Those words became his anthem, echoing in the silence when his stomach growled louder than the television in the corner. At 16, while other kids dreamed of sneakers and summer romances, Carter studied newspapers for business listings. He took odd jobs, not because he wanted pocket change, but because he was collecting knowledge. Washing cars taught him about customer satisfaction. Stocking shelves showed him supply and demand. He began to see patterns others ignored. What people wanted, what they lacked, where small cracks in the market could be widened into opportunity. His first real taste of business came with candy. He bought it wholesale, filled his backpack and sold it at school. The teachers scolded him for breaking rules, but the students kept buying. By graduation, he had saved enough to pay for community college textbooks without asking a soul for help. Every profit, no matter how small, was a declaration. I can build something from nothing. College was not a smooth path. Professors underestimated him. Classmates overlooked him. He remembered walking into lecture halls where eyes shifted and whispers floated, questions about whether he belonged. He smiled through it all, answering with grades that silenced doubts and ideas that sparked admiration. He worked nights as a janitor, scrubbing floors in the same business school buildings where he studied during the day. The irony wasn't lost on him. He cleaned trash from students who never glanced his way, then sat beside them in class hours later, his mind sharper, his hunger fiercer. By his mid-20s, Carter launched his first startup, a small logistics company. Banks refused him loans. Investors ignored his pitches. But he had studied enough to know that while capital mattered, persistence mattered more. He maxed out credit cards, borrowed from cousins, and drove his own beat-up van to deliver packages. The city streets became his classroom. Traffic patterns, supply chains, the quirks of impatient customers. He learned it all firsthand. When competitors mocked him, he worked longer. When clients doubted him, he delivered faster. Slowly, grudgingly, the city began to trust his name. The breakthrough came one rainy night when a Fortune 500 executive's urgent shipment was delayed by every major courier. Carter, soaked to the skin in his van, made the delivery himself. He arrived at the executive's office just past midnight, dripping water onto marble floors but holding the package dry and intact. The executive studied him, then said, "Son, if you run your business with this much grit, I'll give you a contract." That contract multiplied into dozens more. Soon his little company wasn't so little anymore, but success didn't erase the whispers. At meetings, he was still asked if he was with the catering staff. At conventions, he was still mistaken for a driver instead of the owner. Yet each insult only hardened him. Every time someone questioned his place, he built higher. Every time someone doubted his worth, he expanded wider. He reinvested every cent, opening warehouses, hiring staff, upgrading fleets. By his 30s, his logistics empire had become one of the most reliable in the state. By his 40s, it was nationwide. Wealth changed his circumstances, but not the looks in strangers' eyes. He remembered sitting in his first boardroom as the controlling shareholder, only for a new executive to ask, "So who's the real boss?" Carter smiled politely, then presented numbers that silenced the room. Still, the question lingered. The world couldn't believe a man like him could sit at the head of the table. That disbelief became his silent partner. It walked with him into every negotiation, every merger, every deal. His fortune crossed into billions after he diversified. Tech investments, real estate, energy. He had the Midas touch, turning struggling companies into gold with strategy and discipline. Journalists called him a visionary. Analysts called him relentless. But Carter knew the truth. His empire wasn't built on vision alone. It was built on the pain of being told he didn't belong, over and over, until the words lost power and became fuel. And yet, despite the mansions, the yachts, the private jets, there was always one part of him that felt like the boy outside the basketball court. He told himself that ownership would heal it, that one day he would step through gates like these and never feel like an outsider again. That was the dream that carried him through sleepless nights, that kept him grinding when others gave up. And now, here he was, blocked at the very gate that should have been his triumph. The irony was so sharp it almost made him smile. The road to power had been paved with resilience, with fire, with endless sacrifice. And yet tonight, with his empire secured and his name etched in Forbes lists, he was still just the boy hearing those same words. "You don't belong here." The road had carried him far, but it had brought him back to the same wound. And maybe, he thought, that was the point. Maybe power wasn't about escaping the past. It was about facing it, again and again, until you learned how to turn the insult into something immortal. He opened his eyes and looked once more at the gate before him, tall and unforgiving. He had built his road. He had claimed his power. And now it was time to use it, not just for himself but for every boy who had ever been told to step back. The first million came faster than he expected. It wasn't luck. Luck had never been on his side. It was the relentless stacking of small wins until the numbers no longer fit on the same page. Carter remembered the day vividly. He sat in his modest office, a converted warehouse with peeling paint and rattling pipes, when his accountant slid a folder across the desk. "Congratulations," the man said with a grin. "You're officially a millionaire." For a moment, Carter just stared at the numbers. He had spent so long chasing survival, rent, payroll, food for the fridge, that the concept of surplus felt foreign. His hands trembled slightly as he touched the paper. $1 million. The boy who once rationed lunch money now had proof that all the nights of exhaustion, all the humiliations, all the dismissals had crystallized into undeniable success. He thought he would feel invincible. Instead, he felt something quieter, heavier. Relief. But relief didn't last. The next morning, Carter walked into a bank to discuss expansion. He wore his best suit, freshly pressed, shoes polished to a shine. The receptionist greeted him with polite detachment, then handed him a number as though he were applying for a savings account, not negotiating multi-million-dollar lines of credit. When the banker finally met with him, the man spoke slowly as if addressing a child and suggested he start with something more realistic. Carter smiled, placed the folder of financial statements on the table, and let the silence grow until the banker's expression shifted from condescension to shock. Even then, the respect didn't come freely. It had to be dragged out of disbelief. The first million taught Carter that money opened doors, but not all of them. Wealth changed circumstances, yes, but it didn't change the lenses through which people saw him. At industry conferences, competitors shook his hand with forced politeness, eyes darting towards someone else more familiar, more palatable. When he bought his first luxury car, salesmen assumed he was a driver picking it up for someone else. Each moment chipped away at the illusion that money could buy belonging. It could buy property, products, even influence, but not acceptance. Still, the taste of respect, however reluctant, carried its own power. He remembered the first time a competitor called him Mr. Carter instead of dismissing him by his first name. He remembered the way journalists began quoting him in articles, even if their tone was skeptical. Respect was not given. It was pried loose, one clenched finger at a time, until the world had no choice but to acknowledge him. And yet, for all his progress, Carter noticed something unsettling. The more he rose, the more isolated he became. Friends from his neighborhood cheered for him, but also whispered that he had changed. Colleagues from elite circles smiled at him in public, but excluded him from private gatherings. He was too different for both worlds, belonging fully to neither. That realization gnawed at him. Wealth could lift him above, but it also cut him away. It was during this time that Carter began to understand the metaphor of doors and gates. Money gave him keys, but keys didn't always work if the lock was built to exclude. Sometimes, no matter what he carried, the gatekeepers still refused to recognize his ownership. And in those moments he remembered his mother's words again, "Build your own." The thought hardened into philosophy. If the gate wouldn't open, he would construct gates so tall that no one could ignore them. That drive pushed him to reinvest his first million, not into luxuries but into expansion. He bought new trucks for his fleet, hired more drivers, upgraded systems. His staff questioned why he didn't celebrate, why he didn't reward himself. Carter's answer was simple. Respect isn't earned by standing still. Every dollar became a tool, every win a stepping stone. He wasn't chasing comfort, he was chasing permanence. Still, he allowed himself one indulgence, a watch. Sleek, silver, understated but undeniable. When he wore it, people noticed. Some stared with curiosity, others with envy. But Carter wore it not for them, for himself. Every time he checked the time, he remembered the moment in the warehouse office, the trembling hands over the folder, the realization that survival had transformed into success. The watch became a symbol, not of wealth, but of progress. Yet even with the watch ticking on his wrist, he couldn't shake the lesson. Respect won through money was conditional. It could vanish with the next market crash, the next failed deal. What lingered beneath was the same suspicion, the same quiet doubt of his place in spaces that weren't built for him. That knowledge didn't weaken him, it sharpened him. If respect could be taken, he would make sure power couldn't. And so, Carter's hunger grew. The first million wasn't an arrival, it was a doorway to a much larger journey. A journey to billions, a journey to headlines, a journey to gates so wide they couldn't be shut in his face. Now, sitting in his Rolls-Royce decades later, blocked outside his own mansion, he realized the cruel symmetry. The first million had promised acceptance that never fully came. The billions had bought the estate, but not the right to enter. He smiled faintly, bitterly. Maybe belonging was never for sale at any price, but tonight he would show them that power was. The present pressed back against him like a weight, dragging Carter out of memory and into the cold glare of the guard's flashlight. The Rolls-Royce idled softly, its purr almost mocking. Luxury on wheels, yet powerless to roll forward without permission. The gates loomed, their iron bars catching the last traces of moonlight. He had lived through rejection, survived humiliation, conquered industries. But here, on the very threshold of what should have been triumph, he was still waiting for someone else to open the way. The guard's voice came again, sharper this time, tinged with impatience. "Sir, step back, I said residents only." Carter let the words hang in the night air. He studied the man's face, the clenched jaw, the narrowed eyes, the posture of someone convinced of his authority. To the guard, this was routine, protocol. To Carter, it was centuries of history compressed into a single moment. He almost pitied the man, unaware of the storm he was standing in front of. The driver shifted uneasily in his seat, his hands gripping the wheel. "Mr. Carter, or should I explain?" His tone carried both respect and hesitation. Carter raised a hand without looking at him. No, this wasn't about explanations. This wasn't about paperwork. This was about principle. Still, Carter's instinct for strategy held him back from exploding. Anger had won him nothing in the past. Calculation had built his empire. He leaned forward, the leather seat creaking softly beneath him, and lowered the window further. The cool night air wrapped around his face, bringing with it the scent of cut grass and damp earth. "I told you," Carter said, his voice low but resonant. "This is my property. Open the gate." The guard hesitated, his flashlight trembling ever so slightly. Doubt flickered in his eyes, but training, or perhaps arrogance, pulled him back into firmness. "There's no record of that, sir. You'll have to wait for confirmation." Confirmation. The word hit Carter like a slap. Confirmation that he belonged. Confirmation that he had the right to step into a home he had bought with his own billions. The absurdity nearly stole his breath. As minutes stretched, the tension thickened. A car rolled slowly down the street, headlights sweeping across the standoff. Carter could feel the eyes of passers-by, curious glances wondering what was happening at the mansion gate. His pride burned. He was not just fighting for entry, he was on display, his authority questioned in public. He thought of headlines, billionaire CEO denied entry to his own home. The humiliation was no longer private, it had become theater. Carter inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He thought of his mother's wisdom. "Don't fight to be let in, son. Build your own." But this was his own. Built, earned, bought, signed, sealed. Yet here he was, treated like a trespasser. A flicker of guilt touched him. He had thought billions would buy peace, that gates like these would shield him from the sting of exclusion. Instead, the gate had become the stage for the same old play. The driver broke the silence again, his voice strained. "Should I call the head of security?" Carter shook his head slowly. No. Calling would mean appealing for validation. And Carter had promised himself long ago he would never again beg for a seat at any table, never again wait for permission at any door. The guard's hand twitched toward his radio. "I'll need to call backup," he repeated. Carter's jaw tightened. Backup, for the man who signed the payroll, who paid for the uniforms on their backs, who owned the mansion they were guarding. He could almost laugh at the absurdity if it didn't cut so deep. But instead of rage, Carter let silence stretch once more. His stillness was deliberate, a reminder of the power he carried. In boardrooms he had learned the strength of quiet, the way silence could force others to reveal their insecurity, their weakness. Tonight, he wielded it like a blade. He sat back, eyes fixed on the gate, his presence filling the moment with something heavier than anger, inevitability. Inside, though, a storm brewed. Every second dragged him back through time, to the basketball court, the bank, the boardrooms. He could feel the weight of every "you don't belong" pressing against his chest. But he also felt the fire that had carried him here. The boy who didn't belong had grown into the man who built his own empire. And yet, even with billions at his command, the question remained, would the world ever truly see him as belonging? The driver cleared his throat softly, almost afraid to break the tension. "Mr. Carter," he whispered, "people are watching." Carter's eyes flicked toward the car that had slowed down, neighbors peering curiously. His pride burned hotter. This was no longer just about entry. It was about dignity, about the image he projected, not only to strangers, but to every person who had ever doubted him. Finally, Carter leaned forward again, his voice steady, his gaze sharp. "Call whoever you need," he told the guard, "because when this night is over, I promise you, things will not be the same." The guard blinked, momentarily unsettled by the certainty in Carter's tone. He lifted his radio, calling for verification. Carter leaned back once more, the leather seat swallowing him like a throne. He would not raise his voice. He would not beg. He would not explain. He would wait. But his patience was not surrender. It was preparation, because Carter knew something the guard did not. When he finally walked through those gates, it would not just be as a resident. It would be as a conqueror. The night pressed in heavy around the Rolls-Royce, but Carter sat unmoved, his face composed, his heartbeat steadying into the rhythm of decision. Rage might have burned inside him, but rage was never his weapon of choice. Strategy was. Every empire he had built, every competitor he had defeated, every room that once doubted him, he had conquered not by shouting, but by calculating. And tonight, at the gates of his own mansion, would be no different. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The glass surface glowed faintly, casting pale light across his jaw. 100 contacts lived inside this device. Senators he had funded, CEOs who owed him favors, journalists hungry for a story, attorneys who could dismantle contracts with surgical precision. Power, he knew, wasn't just about money. It was about the network of hands waiting for his call. But he did not dial. Not yet. Timing mattered. His silence now was part of the lesson he intended to teach. The guard still hovered, muttering into his radio, glancing nervously at Carter's car as though realizing he had underestimated the man inside. Carter didn't move. He had learned long ago that patience unnerved people more than fury. Let the guard sweat. Let him feel the weight of a presence he couldn't categorize, couldn't dismiss. In the back of his mind, Carter began running scenarios. If the guards doubled down, he could fire them all in one sweeping stroke. He could replace the entire team before sunrise, installing new staff loyal only to him. If the situation escalated further, he could call the local press, let cameras capture the absurdity of a billionaire being denied entry to his own home. The headline alone would sting his enemies and embolden those who saw themselves in his struggle. Every humiliation contained within it the seed of a greater victory. If only one knew how to plant it. The driver spoke quietly, hesitant to break his boss's silence. "Mr. Carter, with your permission, I can call the head of security and clear this up right now." Carter's eyes shifted toward him, calm but firm. "No." The driver nodded quickly, understanding. This wasn't about clearing things up. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about meaning. Carter wasn't simply trying to enter a mansion. He was reclaiming something deeper. The principle that he didn't need confirmation, permission, or validation from anyone. He tapped his phone, not to call but to check messages. A dozen unread emails, a handful of market updates, a notification from his private equity group. Even as he sat here, blocked at the gate, his empire moved like a living organism, stretching across continents, growing in silence. The irony struck him again. He could control global markets with a decision, yet here he was, detained by a flashlight and a protocol manual. It might have been comical if it weren't so telling. Carter allowed himself a small smile. This wasn't the first time his authority had been questioned. He thought back to mergers where competitors underestimated him, only to watch their companies swallowed whole. He thought of boardroom meetings where men tried to talk over him, only to end up quoting his strategies a year later. Every slight had become fuel. Tonight would be no different. The guard might think he was holding power, but in truth, Carter had already decided the ending. His phone buzzed in his hand, a message from his attorney following up on an earlier conversation. Carter almost chuckled. If he wanted, he could forward the situation to his legal team and have the entire security company dismantled in lawsuits by next week. He could buy the agency, fire every man who had doubted him, and install his own empire at the gates. The options were endless. The question was not if he would respond, it was how. For now he chose silence. He let the guard call for backup, let the neighbors whisper, let the night deepen. Because Carter understood something the boy in the schoolyard never had, the most dangerous man is the one who does not rush. Finally, he lifted his gaze from the phone and fixed his eyes on the gate again. The bars stood tall, unyielding, a mirror of every barrier he had faced. But in his mind they were already bending. He saw the moment clearly, guards dismissed, gates swinging open, his footsteps echoing across the driveway of his estate. He would not walk in as a guest. He would enter as a sovereign. The driver fidgeted again, uncomfortable with the stillness. "Sir, forgive me, but how long do you want to sit here?" Carter's voice was calm, deliberate. "As long as it takes. They think they're stalling me. What they don't know is I've been waiting my whole life for this moment." The words lingered in the air, quiet but powerful. The kind of sentence that could be clipped and replayed in speeches, the kind that carried more weight than anger ever could. The guard shifted again, now clearly unsettled. Something in Carter's stillness unnerved him. Something in the man's steady gaze that suggested the balance of power was already shifting. Carter's phone buzzed again, another opportunity waiting in the wings. But he let it buzz. His empire could wait a few minutes longer. Tonight this gate was his battlefield, and patience was his weapon. Because he wasn't simply calculating revenge, he was preparing a lesson. A lesson for the guards, for the neighbors, for anyone watching. Power doesn't knock. Power doesn't beg. Power waits, then enters on its own terms. And when Carter finally chose to move, no one would forget it. The sound of another car rolling slowly past the mansion pierced the silence like a blade. Its headlights washed over the Rolls-Royce, and Carter felt the weight of eyes on him. The world outside was watching now. A neighbor craned her neck from the passenger seat, her face etched with curiosity, perhaps amusement. What story did she imagine? A trespasser in a luxury car, a guest turned away at the gates of wealth he couldn't possibly own. Carter could almost hear the whispers forming, the narrative writing itself without him. Humiliation wasn't new to him, but it had been years since it last felt this raw. For decades he had built walls of power around himself, thick enough to dull the sting of judgment. But tonight, sitting in his own car, at the gates of his own estate, denied entry like a stranger, the sting returned with venom. His chest tightened, not from rage alone, but from the shame of being seen in this position. He could endure insults in private, but humiliation in public was a wound that bled differently. The guard's radio crackled with static. A voice murmured on the other end, muffled but firm. The guard responded in clipped words, his eyes flicking toward Carter's car with suspicion still hard in his gaze. Carter studied him, noting the stubborn posture, the rigid belief that he was protecting something important. The irony was bitter. The man believed he was defending the mansion from intrusion, when in truth he was blocking the very man who had paid for his post. Another car passed, slower this time, its occupants leaning slightly toward the spectacle. Carter imagined tomorrow's gossip. The new resident stopped at his own gate. The billionaire denied entry. He could see the smirks in their voices, the unspoken satisfaction of watching power stumble. Every empire attracted both admirers and detractors, and Carter knew both groups would feast on this story if it slipped into the public. He adjusted his cufflinks, a small gesture of control, as though to remind himself that dignity could not be stripped so easily. But inside, the boy within him, the one who had been told to sit out, to step back, to leave, screamed with familiar fury. His pride burned hotter with each passing moment. He had envisioned his first night at this mansion as a quiet triumph, a moment of solitude and reflection. Instead, it had become a stage of shame. The driver cleared his throat softly. "Sir, the neighbors are slowing down. Maybe we should—" He cut himself off at Carter's glance. Carter's silence was answer enough. They would not retreat. They would not circle the block like beggars waiting for scraps of recognition. No, they would sit, proud and still, until the world bent first. The guard's voice cut through the night again. "Sir, I've called for backup. Please cooperate." The words dripped with finality, as though Carter's refusal to retreat was itself an act of defiance. Backup for the billionaire CEO who had written checks larger than this man's lifetime salary. Backup for the owner of the mansion. It was laughable, but no one laughed. The air was too tight, too heavy with the weight of insult. Carter's phone buzzed once more. He glanced at the screen. A message from a senator he had supported in the last election. Another from the CEO of a company he was in the process of acquiring. He could make a call and have this entire guard company folded by morning. He could summon lawyers, reporters, allies. But he didn't move. He wasn't calculating strategy anymore. He was swallowing humiliation like fire, letting it burn deeper so that when he finally struck, the explosion would shake more than a single gate. The hum of insects grew louder in the silence, a cruel soundtrack to his stillness. Carter's gaze never left the guard. He saw the man shifting uncomfortably now, radio clutched tighter, the weight of uncertainty beginning to press on him. Authority was cracking, slowly, invisibly, under the sheer gravity of Carter's patience. But patience did not erase the sting. Carter felt the humiliation press deeper with every pair of eyes that passed. Every second the gates refused to open. He thought of his childhood self again, standing at the edge of the basketball court, watching others play. He thought of the bank that doubted his million, the boardrooms that underestimated his billions. He thought of all the places where eyes had told him, "You don't belong." And tonight, for all his power, the humiliation returned as if nothing had changed. It wasn't fair, but fairness had never been part of the deal. The driver shifted again, restless. "Mr. Carter," he whispered, "they're making you wait on your own property. That's unacceptable." His voice shook with indignation, reflecting what Carter himself felt. But Carter only nodded once, slowly. "Yes. And that is why they will regret it." The words were quiet, steady, but filled with such conviction that even the driver sat straighter. Carter's humiliation was real, but so was his resolve. He would not let this night end with shame alone. He would make it a turning point, a lesson carved into stone. Because humiliation could crush a man, but in Carter's life, it had always been the forge of something greater. The guards thought they were holding him outside. In truth, they were pushing him into the very center of his strength. The stillness broke. It wasn't sudden, not like an explosion, but it was unmistakable, the kind of shift that bends the air before a storm. Carter inhaled, long and deliberate, then opened the door of the Rolls-Royce. The low click echoed louder than it should have, bouncing off the iron gates as if announcing a reckoning. The driver half-turned, alarm flashing in his eyes. "Mr. Carter, sir." But Carter was already stepping out. The night air wrapped around him, cool and sharp. Gravel crunched beneath his polished shoes as he rose to his full height, shoulders squared, posture radiating a calm so controlled it was more terrifying than fury. The guard stiffened, flashlight beam sliding across Carter's tailored suit, lingering on the diamond cufflinks that caught moonlight like shards of fire. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the guard's face. Carter spoke evenly, his voice carrying the weight of boardrooms and courtrooms, a tone that had silenced senators and CEOs alike. "I told you once. This is my property. You will open the gate." The guard swallowed, shifting his grip on the flashlight. His training urged him to stand firm, but something in Carter's presence made hesitation creep in. "Sir," he began, faltering slightly, "until I get clearance, Clearance?" Carter cut him off, his voice still calm, but edged like a blade. "Do you know who signs the checks that pay you? Do you know whose name is on every brick beyond this gate? You are demanding clearance from the very man who built the ground you're standing on." Silence. The driver sat frozen, watching, his hands gripping the wheel as if to anchor himself. The guard faltered again, then lifted his radio. Static crackled, but Carter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Call whoever you want, but understand this. By the time the night is over, your job will not exist." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Spoken softly, they carried a certainty more powerful than anger. The guard's jaw tightened, pride battling fear. He opened his mouth to respond, but Carter took another step forward, eyes never leaving his. For a moment, time bent. The mansion loomed behind the gate, silent and untouched. The prize he had worked his whole life to claim. The boy in the schoolyard screamed inside him, "Do not step back. Do not let them tell you again that you don't belong." And for the first time tonight, Carter let that boy's voice guide him. His chest rose, his shoulders squared higher, and he spoke with finality. "I am done waiting." He reached for his phone, not to call lawyers or allies, but to dial one number directly, the head of his corporate security division. The line clicked almost instantly. "Yes, Mr. Carter," a voice answered. Carter's eyes never left the guard as he spoke into the phone, each word measured. "Fire the entire team at the mansion, effective immediately. Send replacements by dawn." The words dropped into the night like thunder. The guard froze, his radio still buzzing faintly. The driver exhaled sharply, the sound almost a gasp. Carter lowered the phone, the conversation finished. He didn't need to explain, didn't need to repeat himself. Orders like that didn't require justification. They created their own reality. The guard's mouth opened, then closed. His authority, so firm minutes ago, dissolved in the face of a truth he couldn't argue. He was a man holding a flashlight against the owner of empires, and that empire had just erased him. Carter turned slightly, gesturing toward the gates with nothing more than a flick of his hand. "Now," he said, calm as ever. "Open them." For a heartbeat, the guard stood paralyzed, caught between pride and fear. Then slowly, almost mechanically, he pressed the button on his console. The iron gates groaned, swinging open with the sound of grinding metal. The creak was music to Carter's ears, not because of victory, but because of what it meant. The gate had mocked him, resisted him, humiliated him. Now it yielded. Carter stepped back toward the car. His driver met his eyes, awe mingled with respect. Carter said nothing as he slid back into the seat. The door closed with a soft thud, the hum of the engine filling the silence once more. The Rolls-Royce rolled forward, gravel crunching, tires whispering against the driveway. And as the car passed through the gate, Carter allowed himself one breath, slow, steady, almost relieved. But this wasn't relief. It was something sharper, a vow forming in his chest. He had snapped tonight, yes, but not into chaos, into clarity. Because this wasn't about one guard, it wasn't about one gate. It was about every barrier that had ever stood before him, and tonight proved a lesson he would never forget. You don't wait for the world to grant you entry. You take it. The Rolls-Royce rolled slowly up the driveway, its headlights spilling across the mansion's towering facade. The gates closed behind with a heavy clang, but the sound did not soothe him. Carter leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowing as the house came into view. His house, his symbol of triumph. Yet the taste in his mouth was bitter. He had entered, yes, but not as a man welcomed home. He had entered as one who forced the door. That distinction mattered. The driver glanced at him nervously, sensing the storm still brewing. "Sir, you want me to pull up to the front?" Carter gave a small nod. The car glided forward, gravel crunching beneath its weight. At the base of the marble steps, Carter stepped out again, the cool air brushing his face, grounding him. He looked up at the house, every stone a reminder of his long climb, every window reflecting not just wealth, but struggle. He had built this life, and tonight, no one would soil it with disrespect. He dialed again. The phone buzzed once before his head of corporate security answered. "Mr. Carter." "Execute the order," Carter said. "Not just the gate guard. Every man on the mansion detail. Fired. Effective immediately." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Understood. I'll dispatch a new team by morning. You want them briefed on protocol personally?" "Yes," Carter said coldly. "Brief them on who I am, on what this property represents. I don't want another man standing on this ground confused about whose house he's protecting." "Consider it done, sir." Carter ended the call without another word. The decision wasn't anger. It was necessity. Respect could not be negotiated. It had to be enforced. If his wealth, his title, his ownership meant nothing to those meant to guard him, then their employment was worthless. He would not tolerate doubt at his own gates. Not here, not ever. He turned back toward the driveway. The guard who had denied him entry was still standing near the gate, frozen by the reality of what had just unfolded. Carter's voice carried across the night, steady and unflinching. "You're finished here. Leave your badge, leave your post, and don't return." The man hesitated, swallowing hard. "Sir, I was only following—" Carter raised a hand, cutting him off with silence. "I built my life on following rules until they no longer served me. But this is not a rule. This is disrespect, and disrespect has no place here." The guard's shoulders slumped. Slowly, he unclipped his badge and set it down on the console by the gate. For a moment, Carter almost pitied him, but pity had no place tonight. This wasn't about one man. It was about a principle. By the time Carter returned to the steps of the mansion, 2 more guards had emerged from the shadows, drawn by the radio chatter. They stopped short when they saw him, their postures stiffening. One of them started to speak, but Carter's gaze silenced him. "You're all dismissed," Carter said simply. "Every last one of you. Collect your things. Leave." The men exchanged glances, confusion flickering in their eyes. One of them protested, voice thin. "Sir, we're here for your protection. This is a mistake." Carter's laugh was soft, bitter. "A mistake? You think protection means barring me from my own home? You think loyalty is measured by suspicion? No. The mistake was trusting a team that doesn't know who they serve. Tonight, that ends." The guards hesitated, but Carter's voice grew sharper, final. "Leave, or be escorted off by sunrise when the new team arrives. Either way, you're done." Silence. The guards shifted, reluctant but powerless. They had seen enough men like Carter in headlines to know, when he spoke like this, it wasn't bluster. It was decree. The driver stood nearby, eyes wide with quiet awe. He had worked for Carter long enough to know his boss was ruthless in business, but tonight was different. This wasn't about money or contracts. This was about dignity, carved into stone at the very gates of his home. Carter ascended the steps, each stride deliberate. At the top he paused and turned back, surveying the scene. Guards stripped of power, gates standing open, the mansion glowing with silent grandeur behind him. This was not the entrance he had imagined, but perhaps it was the one fate intended. Not a soft arrival, but a statement. He spoke one last time, his voice carrying across the driveway like a gavel. "Respect is not requested, it is commanded. Remember that." Then he entered the mansion, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him with a sound that felt like closure, like finality. But deep inside, Carter knew this was not the end. Tonight was a wound, but also a weapon, and what began as humiliation would be remembered as a declaration. The door closed behind him with a weighty thud, and silence swallowed him whole. For the first time that night, the mansion belonged to him without dispute. Yet as Carter stepped into the grand foyer, polished marble floors gleaming beneath chandeliers, the silence did not welcome him. It pressed on him. The house was beautiful, magnificent even, but it felt hollow, as though waiting for something more than money to make it come alive. He moved slowly through the halls, shoes clicking against stone, the sound echoing too loudly in the emptiness. Every detail screamed wealth: the sweeping staircase, the gilded mirrors, the oil paintings imported from Europe. Yet Carter felt no triumph, no satisfaction. The humiliation at the gate clung to him like a second skin. He had entered, yes, but not as a man embraced by his home. He had stormed in, wounded and hardened. He paused by a window overlooking the driveway. From here he could see the guards gathering their things in the shadows, moving like men already erased from the story. Beyond them the gate stood ajar, their black bars stretching tall against the night sky. A symbol of power, yes, but also of exclusion. They were his now, paid for with his billions. Yet a part of him still saw them as barriers, reminders of every door he had once been denied. Turning away, Carter let his hand trail across the cool stone of the wall. He remembered the first night he dreamed of such a place, lying on a mattress too thin to soften the springs, staring at a cracked ceiling, promising himself that one day he would own more than survival. He had achieved it. He had crossed every line society drew against him, and still, tonight, he felt like the boy peering through fences at something just out of reach. The loneliness of power gnawed at him. He had people, staff, advisors, allies, but no one who shared the journey fully. Wealth had lifted him into a rarefied air where few could follow, where every smile carried calculation and every friendship bore weight. Even tonight's humiliation could not be shared honestly. Who could he tell? Who would understand? His empire was vast, but in this cavernous mansion Carter felt smaller than he had in years. He walked into the library, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes he had yet to read. The scent of polished wood filled the air. He sank into a chair by the fireplace, though no fire burned there yet. He stared at the empty hearth, his mind circling. He had fought for this life, earned it with every sleepless night, every scar. But the truth pressed on him like a shadow. Respect could not be purchased. Money could buy obedience, yes, it could buy admiration, envy, even fear. But respect, the kind that recognized his belonging without question, was rarer than diamonds. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen. Messages from his attorney confirming the dismissal order. A text from the head of security promising replacements by dawn. Efficient, clean, as always. Carter silenced the phone. He didn't need confirmation. Not tonight. Tonight, confirmation itself felt like an insult. Instead, he leaned back and closed his eyes. The humiliation replayed in fragments, the flashlight in his face, the command to step back, the casual certainty that he didn't belong. It echoed against memories of the schoolyard, the bank, the boardroom. It was the same wound carved deeper with each repetition. And yet, he realized, it was also the source of his power. Every slight had fueled his climb. Every denial had sharpened his resolve. Without exclusion would he have built so high. Without humiliation would he have forged such fire. A soft laugh escaped him, bitter and weary. Power was a strange companion. It gave everything but healed nothing. It built mansions but couldn't fill them. It opened markets but not hearts. And it demanded sacrifices, the kind that left a man standing alone in silence, surrounded by everything he had ever wanted, still searching for the one thing he couldn't buy. He opened his eyes again, staring at the unlit fireplace. So this is it, he murmured to himself. The price of power. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. They were not complaint, not regret, just truth. A truth he had always known but never felt so clearly until tonight. And yet, beneath the bitterness, a spark of resolve burned. He had not endured humiliation just to sit broken in silence. If the world insisted on reminding him of its gates, he would turn every gate into a stage. He would use this moment, this wound, as he always had, not as an end, but as fuel. He stood again, tall and unyielding. The mansion was empty, yes. The night was heavy, yes. But Carter was not finished. Not tonight, not ever. The humiliation had stung him deeply, but it had also reminded him of who he was. A man who did not crumble. A man who turned every insult into empire. As he climbed the grand staircase toward the master suite, the chandelier lights glimmered above him, throwing fractured patterns across the marble floor, and Carter whispered to himself, not as reassurance, but as prophecy. They'll remember this night, not as the night I was denied, but as the night I took it all back. Sleep did not come easily. Carter lay awake in the vast expanse of his new bedroom, the ceiling so high it seemed to vanish into shadows. The silence pressed in heavy, his mind replaying the night's humiliation in jagged fragments. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the flashlight beam across his face, heard the words "residents only," felt the sting of dismissal. But tonight, something else surfaced alongside the pain, an echo from years ago, the voice of a man who had once shaped his path. His mentor. Carter had met him in his 20s, back when ambition was sharp, but resources were scarce. Mr. Lawrence, a seasoned businessman, tall, dignified, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see beyond the moment. He was one of the first men who looked at Carter and saw not just potential but inevitability. Their first conversation happened in a cramped diner at the edge of the city, where Lawrence leaned across the table and spoke words that would brand themselves into Carter's memory forever. "Son," Lawrence had said, his voice calm but cutting, "power doesn't buy acceptance. It enforces it." At the time, Carter had bristled. He believed in the dream that money would be enough, that wealth would smooth away prejudice, that success would silence doubters. Lawrence shook his head when Carter voiced those hopes. No amount of money will make them forget who you are. No mansion, no car, no title will erase the fact that some people will always see you as less. Don't chase their acceptance. Make them respect you. Make them remember your name even if they grit their teeth when they say it. Those words had carried Carter through his first real battles. When bankers dismissed him, he remembered, enforce respect. When rivals mocked him, he remembered, enforce respect. When boardrooms underestimated him, he remembered, enforce respect. Each time, the words became a shield, a compass. And yet, somewhere along the climb to billions, Carter had let himself believe that perhaps the scale of his empire had transcended that truth, that maybe, just maybe, acceptance had finally come. Tonight at the gate, he realized how wrong he had been. He rose from the bed, restless, and walked to the balcony. The night air was cool, the city lights flickering faintly in the distance. Below, the driveway lay quiet, the dismissed guards long gone, their absence leaving the grounds eerily still. Carter leaned against the railing, the weight of memory heavier than the night itself. He remembered another conversation with Lawrence. Years after that first diner meeting, Carter had just closed his biggest deal to date and was basking in the glow of press coverage. Lawrence had congratulated him but offered caution. Celebrate, yes, but don't mistake applause for acceptance. Applause fades. Respect must be renewed every single day, and sometimes the only way to renew it is with force. At the time, Carter thought the advice cynical, but tonight, he understood its wisdom with painful clarity. The guards at the gate hadn't been villains. They were simply extensions of a system that doubted him, no matter how high he climbed. Acceptance had never been theirs to give. Respect, that he could take, demand, enforce. Carter exhaled, the breath sharp against the night. He whispered into the darkness, as if speaking to Lawrence across time. "You were right. You were always right." The memory steadied him. The humiliation still burned, but it no longer felt like defeat. It felt like fuel. He could almost see Lawrence's approving nod, hear the words again. Don't chase their acceptance. Enforce respect. Carter straightened, his resolve crystallizing. The firing of the security team had been the first step, but it could not end there. This night demanded more than reaction. It demanded transformation. The mansion, the gates, the guards, all of it had to become part of a greater statement. He would not merely live here. He would turn this estate into a monument to his journey, a place where every barrier that tried to hold him back became a symbol of his refusal to bow. As he turned back into the room, Carter paused at the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. He thought of the boy in the schoolyard, the young man in the bank, the entrepreneur delivering packages in the rain. All of them lived inside him still, and all of them demanded justice for every "you don't belong." Tonight was not an ending. It was a reminder, a call to arms. Back at the bedside table, his phone buzzed again. A text from his attorney. "Do you want to issue a formal statement about the firing?" Carter stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed a single reply. Not yet. Because he wasn't ready to speak. Not tonight. Tonight, he was listening. To the voice of his mentor, to the fire in his chest, to the truth that had shaped his life. Acceptance was an illusion. Respect was survival, and Carter was determined to enforce it, louder than ever before. Morning crept slowly into the mansion, light spilling through tall windows in golden beams. Carter had not slept. Instead, he sat in the library, a leather-bound journal open before him, pen in hand. He hadn't written in years. Most of his thoughts lived in contracts, balance sheets, and negotiations. But last night demanded something different. It demanded reflection, a vow etched in ink so it could not be forgotten. He stared at the blank page, the silence heavy around him, then began to write. At first, the words came slowly, jagged. Last night at my own gates I was told I didn't belong. His hand paused. The sentence looked surreal on the page. A billionaire CEO denied at the entrance of his own mansion. Yet the truth was undeniable, and writing it made it sharper. He continued, I have spent my life building doors where none existed. I have built empires, created opportunities, and turned rejection into power. And still, the world looks at me and sees an outsider. But this humiliation will not be buried. It will be transformed. The pen moved faster now, his resolve deepening with each word. This house is more than property. It is a monument to resilience, and if the world insists on putting up gates, I will not merely pass through them, I will own them. I will make them symbols not of exclusion but of defiance. Every locked door I was ever denied will now stand as proof that I refuse to bow. He closed the journal, the sound of the cover snapping shut echoing like a gavel. For the first time since the gate confrontation, Carter felt something other than rage or humiliation. He felt clarity. He would not hide this night as a scar. He would wield it as a story, a torch for others who carried the same wound. His phone buzzed on the desk, a message from his head of communications. The press has caught wind of the incident. They're asking for comment. Carter picked up the phone, thumb hovering over the screen. He could spin it quietly, bury it before it spread. Or he could let it breathe, let the world see the truth, and turn the humiliation into a declaration. He thought of Lawrence's words, respect must be enforced. And then he thought of his mother's. Don't fight to be let in, son. Build your own. Both voices pointed him to the same choice. He wouldn't bury the story. He would claim it, own it, turn it into a weapon sharper than any dismissal. He called his communications director. Draft a statement, Carter said, but not the usual polished nonsense. I want honesty. I want the world to know what happened at those gates. The director hesitated. Sir, you're certain the optics, Carter cut in, are exactly why we're doing this. Let them see the truth. Let them see that money doesn't erase the fight. And let them see that I am not ashamed of it. This isn't weakness, it's power. Silence then, a steady, understood. Carter hung up and leaned back, exhaling. He could already imagine the headlines. Billionaire denied entry to his own mansion. Some would mock him, yes. Some would laugh. But others, millions of others, would see themselves in his story. They would see every gate that had been closed on them, every room they had been excluded from, every insult that told them they didn't belong. And they would see what he did next. Redemption wasn't about erasing humiliation. It was about using it, about standing taller because of it. As the morning deepened, Carter walked through the mansion again. The house no longer felt hollow. It felt like a stage waiting for its purpose. The gates that had mocked him hours ago would now become symbols. He would tell their story so often, so powerfully, that they would no longer represent exclusion. They would represent defiance. He paused by the front doors, sunlight spilling in, and whispered to himself, almost like a promise, they thought they humiliated me, but I will make this my anthem. The loneliness of the night before had faded, replaced by something larger, a sense of mission. His empire was built on resilience, but his legacy would be built on what he did with moments like this, moments when dignity was tested, and he chose to transform the wound into fire. He lifted his phone once more, sending a message to his communications team. This isn't just about me. Frame it as universal. Make it clear. Every gate they close on us only makes us stronger. He set the phone down and straightened his shoulders. The humiliation had been sharp, but redemption was sharper. He would not walk away from this as a man wounded. He would walk away as a man defined not by the insult, but by the defiance that followed. And somewhere deep inside, the boy who once heard "You don't belong here" finally smiled. By afternoon, The mansion's new security detail had already begun to arrive, men in crisp uniforms, moving with precision and respect. They greeted Carter with firm nods, their eyes carrying the weight of instruction. They knew who he was, and they knew why they were here, but Carter barely noticed them. His attention was fixed on the gates. The same iron bars that had humiliated him the night before now stood gleaming in the sunlight, their black steel cutting sharp lines against the blue sky. They looked unchanged, but Carter knew better. A gate is never just metal. A gate is memory. A gate is metaphor. And for him, this one would never be the same again. He walked slowly down the driveway, each step deliberate, until he stood before the towering structure. The air smelled faintly of oil and iron. He placed one hand on the cold bars, letting the steel bite against his palm. For a long moment he simply stood there, silent, remembering. He remembered the schoolyard fence, where he had watched other boys play while he was told to sit out. He remembered the glass doors of banks, where loan officers smirked at his ambition. He remembered the locked gates of country clubs, of boardrooms, of every place that whispered or shouted, "You don't belong." And then he remembered last night, the flashlight in his face, the words "residence only," the humiliation so raw it had nearly broken him. But it hadn't. It had reforged him. Carter exhaled and whispered aloud, as if speaking to the gate itself, "You are not my prison. You are my proof." The words rolled off his tongue with finality. He felt them in his chest, steady as a vow. Every gate that had been shut in his face had brought him here, had sharpened him, had given him fire. This one would be no different. It would not live as a wound, it would live as a weapon. He stepped back, studying the structure from a distance. "People will remember this gate," he said softly. "Not because it kept me out, but because I made it open." Behind him, one of the new guards approached cautiously. "Sir, would you like us to change the system? New codes, new locks?" Carter shook his head. "No, leave it as it is. Every time I pass through these gates, I want to remember last night. I want to remember that no matter how high you climb, the world will still try to bar your entry. And I want to remember that power doesn't wait. It walks through anyway." The guard nodded, stepping back, leaving Carter alone with his thoughts. He stood there longer, letting the sun warm his face, letting the symbol of the gate settle deeper into his mind. He thought of his mother's words, "Don't fight to be let in, build your own," and his mentors, "Power doesn't buy acceptance, it enforces it." Both truths now lived in the steel of this gate, in the story it carried. One day he knew this story would be told beyond his mansion walls. It would be told to young men and women standing outside their own gates, waiting to be let in. It would be told in speeches, in books, in conversations whispered between dreamers. And when they heard it, they would understand. Gates are not just barriers. They are mirrors. They show you what the world thinks you cannot have. And then they dare you to take it anyway. Carter turned at last, walking back toward the mansion, the gates still looming behind him. He no longer felt their weight as humiliation. He felt them as a crown, because the true symbol of power is not the gate that opens easily. It is the gate that resists, and the man who forces it wide. At the top of the marble steps, he paused once more, glancing back. The gates glimmered in the afternoon light, tall and unyielding. And Carter whispered the words that would define not just this day, but his legacy. "I will never beg entry again. From now on, I own every gate I face, and the ones I cannot own, I will tear down." The mansion doors closed behind him, sealing the vow. And in that moment, Carter knew. The boy who once stood outside fences had finally claimed them, not as walls, but as monuments. Carter believed his enemies were finished, but this was only chapter 1. The mansion gate was just the beginning, and the battles ahead will be greater, sharper, and more defining. If you don't want to miss what comes next, stay locked in. Subscribe now, because the story isn't over.